Okay, so this video cast is designed to support you with writing multiple choice questions. So you've got an assessment for this module, which is to write a multiple choice question each week based upon the papers that have been provided. And what this is about is getting to understand about how you can construct a question in such a way that it's both a question that is challenging but not overly difficult, a question that is not too easy, but also making sure that we have alternate answers that are not so obviously incorrect that it becomes a meaningless kind of exercise. And so this is going to kind of show you how you construct that. It's less about the explanation. The explanation is part of the Peerwise video cast which accompanies this as well. So, if we think about these kind of questions, you think about the questions that were asked in trimester 1 in the Strength and Power module. The questions are much more about knowledge than they are about facts, because facts is merely finding a very, very simple answer. You know, for example, what was the mass of the participants in the study? Well, that is literally very simple. I can use a Control F if it's a PDF and go and find the answer. Don't want fact-based questions. We want them to be much more about knowledge. Remember, the whole notion of this is your peer learning. You're assisting each other in the learning process. So you've got to think about the way in which you construct these questions. So I've put here as an example, you might have a question which requires selecting the best answer. So which is the best answer? That's kind of more of a knowledge-based one. Or it might be that you ask a question in such a way that means that somebody has got to go and interpret the paper. One of the big things I would say when you're putting your questions together is please, please, please make the question succinct. Make it very, very concise. Because as soon as a question becomes too long, or the statement becomes too long, it's got the potential to become confusing and ambiguous. So for example, as I've written here, don't offer superfluous information as an introduction to a question. So for example, the presence and association of the coach seems to have profound effects on the team cohesion. Research has shown that in soccer players, the presence of a manager has the following effect. So get rid of the superfluous part. The question should just simply be, research has shown that in soccer players, the presence of a manager has the following effect, and then you get your options. As soon as you start adding in superfluous information, it becomes much harder at times for other individuals to understand what the question is that you're asking, and they potentially get confused by all the additional information rather than perhaps being confused or challenged by the question itself. So content is really important. Connected to that is the notion of structure. One of the things I would absolutely say is this: if you try and use a true-false, I will delete the question and ask you to redo it. Because the problem with true-false is it's a 50-50 chance, isn't it? So it's not a challenge to the individual. It's a 50-50 option. So what I want you to do is think about using questions that pose more than 3 options. So for example, don't ask questions such as, well, which of the following is true or false? And then getting a kind of unrelated options. You want to make sure that your question focuses on specific aspects of the course reading primarily, but can connect to the lecture material as well, because that's wider reading. And one of the things that you'll see through Peerwise, if you go to the Peerwise videocast, is you as somebody answering questions and I as somebody reviewing them can actually rate the difficulty of questions. Something I would encourage you to do is use combination answers. So rather than going, well, the answer is A, so why not have something like, you know, well, it's such as A only or B only or C only. Why not say, well, actually, the answer is, you know, for example, it's B and A are correct. So in other words, it's got multiple aspects to the answer, because that creates a more challenging learning environment and means that we're not simply taking a 1 in 4, 1 in 5 guess based on the number of answers. We've got to think. So I would encourage you to try and come up with questions that are designed to push the reader and get them to think about combinations of answers. Then I want you to think about options. I think, as I've just said, I think using questions with varying numbers of options is really important. One of the things I would say is there is no evidence, we look at psychometric studies, there's no evidence to having a uniform number of answers. So you'll notice last semester when you did the MCQs for me, that some questions were 4, some were 5. I think in some I even gave you 8 options, okay? It just depends to a certain degree on the question that has been asked. If you only have, you can have 2 or 3, but it's very, very rare, particularly with 2. The minimum you're going to be allowed to have is 3, and on a lot of occasions I will actually reject 3 if I think that actually that there are more options that you could have. The key is that you're trying to offer distractors, that is the alternate answers, that are going to cause the person answering the questions to have to think, to have to read, to have to kind of consume the information. Please don't use all of the above. So if you use kind of an all of the above one, which is, well, it's all of the above, it's either yes or no, isn't it? It's either not all of the above, or it's all of the above. It's kind of a true or false. So don't use all of the above, because if it's all of the above, then it means they can't have one on their own. It either is or it isn't. So don't use all of the above as one of the options. But do ask questions with none of the above, because that is really important, particularly if you're going to ask them to do some data analysis. And I would implore you to get people to do some data analysis. You as yourself, as the person writing the question, may think, well, actually, that's an important skill. And this is about learning skills, and it's about developing your competencies, in this case as a physiologist. So perhaps writing questions, and I'll show you some examples in a moment of these kind of questions, but perhaps writing questions whereby we are asked to make an evaluation, as I was doing in trimester 1, where I would ask you to interpret the data. That's very valuable. But it could simply be that you've got 4 or 5 options with answers, and then it goes, well, actually, none of the above are correct. That works rather than all of the above. We've mentioned about not using superfluous information. Don't use what are called determiners in distractors. So what this means is the distractors have to be, that is the alternate answers, have to be answers that look like they could be genuinely correct. If you've got something, so for example, let's say you've got a physiology question. This has been way too easy, but this is a good example. Let's say you've got a physiology question which states, it's physiology. What does ATP stand for? Okay, and one of your answers is the amateur tennis. Amateur tennis professionals or something like that. I don't know. It doesn't make sense. Association of Tennis Professionals. That makes sense. Then you know that straight away that's an inappropriate answer, so you can discard, because we're doing physiology. It's not going to be that. So make sure that your alternate answers are answers that actually work. And then don't repeat wording in the stem. That is, that the stem is the question you're asking in the correct option. It's too obvious if you do that. Okay? So make sure that when you're writing your answers, your options, that they are using different wording from the wording that you have stated in the question. This is all fundamentally important in making sure that we're challenging each other, that we're not making it so easy that we're not learning from the process. Remember, this is about learning from each other. So when we go to the rationale, there has to be, well, it should contain information as to why a choice is correct, as well as why the distractors are incorrect. So this is your commentary. This is your, okay, I'm going to explain to you now the explanation as to why this is the case. So I'm going to show you an example of how this would look within Peer Why. So here we've got a question that was asked. It's interesting, it's only got a 3-answer option, and actually that was perfectly valid given the kind of question that was being asked. So VO2 max will be achieved during testing providing which criteria are met. And so we've got the 3 option answers here, but then this is the fundamentally the important part. Here's the explanation. So they're referring to the paper, and what they have gone for is here, right, they're taking the actual statement from the paper, and they're even referring to the figure. So this is directly taken. And then what they've done is they've then given an explanation for each answer, and they're going, well, look, the reason it's not A is heavy intensity or subcritical power it should be insufficient rather than insufficient to elicit VO2 max, irrespective of durations. So that wouldn't be the answer. C, as stated above, supercritical power above critical power, severe domain workload will elicit VO2 max, providing the duration is long enough. So in other words, what they're doing is they're giving you an explanation that allows you to learn about why the answer is correct and why the distractors are incorrect. And that's fundamentally important. It is not simply about why answer C is correct. You have to have explanations about why the distractors are incorrect. This comes back to having distractors that are potentially logical answers. So it could, you read these, and particularly if you haven't got a background yet in physiology, but if you have, you'd read it, well, actually these could theoretically make sense. But if I understand the topic and I've done the reading, I'll be able to understand why they're not the case. If you got it wrong, okay, let's find out why. So this is fundamentally important. This is the explanation as to why they don't make sense. So we have to have that, and you have to provide that. So if you don't provide an explanation, or the explanation isn't suitable, your question will be rejected. The explanation is fundamentally important in the learning process. Not only are we setting questions, which for you means that you are learning, because there's a huge amount of learning going on in terms of setting questions, but fundamentally, you're encouraging each other in the learning process for providing that explanation, the rationale. So this is about thinking about your thinking. You have to think about how you're going to write this. You've got to think about how you put the question together, but you've got to think about that explanation. You've got to think about, am I providing information that somebody else can learn from? And this is something really important. It's about phrasing. This is from what is called Bloom's taxonomy. So Bloom's taxonomy is basically the way certain words refer to certain constructs. So for example, if we're dealing with knowledge, knowledge kind of wording is things like defining or identify or list or name or recognize. If we're thinking about, for example, an analysis question, we might use analyze or compare or contrast or distinguish or determine or investigate. So what I want you to do is make sure that you understand the kind of question you're asking. Are you going to ask a straight knowledge question? Are you going to ask an analysis question? Are you going to ask them to comprehend something? So comprehension is maybe, it comes from kind of understanding what maybe has been written. So can they differentiate between this finding and this finding? Can they explain? Could they rephrase? So maybe your question is, you've literally taken a paragraph from the paper and you have reinterpreted it in terms of paraphrasing it, and you go, right, I now want you to rephrase this. Which one is the correct rephrasing of this? All sorts of different ways in which you can ask the question. This is fundamentally about learning from each other, and getting the language right is an important aspect of that process. So, two things to think about. We've got questions which are knowledge-based thinking. So, you know, if it can be located on a single page of the paper, then it's just knowledge-based thinking. Well, that's fine. We don't mind those questions, but I want you to move past that. Multi-logical based thinking requires that the answer be derived from more than one construct, concept, or idea. So those are questions where we may have to connect the paper to the lecture material, you may have to connect the paper to the practicals. You may have to connect the paper to seminar learning. We may have to connect the paper to another skill. So, for example, data handling, interpretation of information. So we can have both kinds of these questions. One is not going to be overwritten by the other, but I would encourage you as the questioner, the person putting them together, that as you move through this, you've got a number of weeks to do these, try both approaches. Try questions where it's based upon solely the paper, which is knowledge-based thinking, or where it is multi-logical based thinking, where you're kind of connecting your question, connecting the paper to an alternate area or an alternate source of information. So I'm going to show you some examples here. These are some really nice questions, and you can see here some really nice kind of feedback. Now these are not for the module, so just be wary, these are not necessarily from the module, but you can see here. So we've got a question. So Pavalainen states that improved neuromuscular characteristics from explosive type strength training are not accompanied by the observable hypertrophy because, and they give you the four answers. But can you see now, when we come into our section below, which is our explanation, how detailed that is? The explanation is going, well, this is why it's not A, this is why it is B. And they even refer to the page in the paper, why it's not C, and why it's not D. So we've got a lot of clear information to base this upon. If we look at an alternate approach, which I think is very good, it's from another strength paper. This is Hakkinen. Over 24-week training period, by how much did the maximum isometric leg extension force increase? And what they've done is they've given us the answers, but they're actually helping you with the use of the graph. It's a little bit simplistic in terms of the explanation, but using graphs is something I would encourage you to do. You can, using Peerwise, embed graphs into the question. Interpret this graph. Same here. So what we've got here is kind of the use of a graph in the question. So what they've stated is they're showing the graph, what conclusion can possibly be drawn from figure 6, and then they're giving you the questions related, the distractors and the correct answer related to that. So using graphs can be done, and is something I would absolutely encourage you to think about doing, because a lot of the papers will actually contain graph-based material. And you can see the same here. Does the graph above support the idea that changes in sex hormones during puberty led to drastic increases in responses to strength training? So the explanation is not great, but the question is really good because they're using the graph. We've got only 3 answers. That's okay, didn't mind that at all. But the explanation is the bit that is limiting. So one of the things to think about is, if you're going to use graphs, don't just go, well, look at the graph. You have to give the explanation. And fundamentally, you have to explain the distractors and the correct answer. This is a really nice kind of question, okay? So here we've got, what is the correct equation to work out effect size for conducting a meta-analysis? So it's got a meta-analysis in one of the papers, and these are the formulae that they have provided, and it's really good. Can you go into the paper and understand a little bit about what the paper is asking, and interpret and make sure that you're picking the right formulae? It's a really nice little question. That's a knowledge-based question. So it's not linking to anything else. It's not multi-logical. It's a logical-based question. And then we've got this one here within the Hennessy paper. What was the percentage difference between the pre and post training for the 1RM squat group regarding the control group? So what they've got is they've got the explanation using the data to explain it. It needed a little bit more of an explanation because all they've done is explained this one here. But really all it needed was just to work through the formulae and go, well, this is why it's not this answer or this answer or this answer. But in essence, by doing the calculation, they're showing you, they're teaching you. My advice would be here, it needs more of an explanation about what the variables mean in the formulae, because remember, you're teaching each other. So this not only teaches you because you're writing the question, which is really good, but you're teaching the other people who are answering the questions as well. And here's an alternate one, which is an interesting one. In which direction of travel does Riley 2007 produces greatest jet lag? But notice the explanation is terrible. On page 2, symptoms are felt more acutely. So this is not an explanation. It's not a particularly good question, but this is certainly not an explanation. If you compare that explanation to, for example, this explanation here, you can see a considerable difference in the amount of information that's provided, but also the amount of effort that has been put in. This only works as an assessment if you all engage with putting the effort in by learning from each other. So if you are just somebody that's writing these kind of explanations, you're not helping yourself and you're not helping other people learn. The same here, we've got a very poor explanation, and again, it's not a particularly good question. We've only got these 3 answers, and it's actually one of those where you can just work it out, because look, we've got none of the above, but none of the above, there is only 2 answers. If you're going to use none of the above, there needs to be 4 or 5 alternates to work from. Same here, very, very poor explanation. Is the Gold et al. Paper, so this doesn't make sense. Sorry, in the Gold et al. Paper, which of the following was a limitation to the study? So only time domain and not frequency domain variables were available. Only time domain, not frequency domain variables were available for the study. It's not a good question, and it's not a good explanation. It doesn't explain why that is a limitation. Remember, the question is, why is that a limitation? So why is that a limitation? Why are these in the paper therefore deemed not to be limitations? Remember, this is about teaching each other. So there's a lot of information to go through, and what I want you to do is think very carefully about the whole process, that what you are doing as part of this is you're learning by writing the questions and the distractors, but you're also teaching others by the questions and distractors, but fundamentally by the explanation which you're providing. If you want to learn more about how to kind of set everything up in Peerwise, go and watch the additional very short video cast on setting up an account in Peerwise.